Welcome back to the Bear Market Brief podcast. I'm your host, Aaron, and thank you as always for joining. Today we're going out there, and I mean way out there, to Khabarovsk Krai. For a sense of just how far away Khabarovsk is, you can find it on a map by going to Osaka, Japan, and then heading north. Most American Russian specialists haven't been there, let alone most Americans, let alone most Russians. Simply put, Moscow's gravity just isn't as strong out there. Khabarovsk has seen mass protest over the detention of Regional Governor Sergei Furgal on curiously timed murder charges. Yes, you heard that right. Joining us to discuss regional political dynamics is Kirill Shamiev. Kirill is a PhD candidate at Central European University, where he's working on Russian civil-military relations. He's also a junior research fellow at the Center for Comparative Governance Studies at the Higher School of Economics. And perhaps most importantly, he has lived in Khabarovsk for years. He was able to offer some really granular insights about what's going on there. We hope you enjoy. Kirill, so good to have you today.
Thanks for having me.
So, we are here today to talk about the situation in Khabarovsk, which is a region with an interesting recent history, and I'm sure an interesting history before that, which you can share more about. As a native of the region, I wanted to ask you quickly for context for listeners, if you could tell us a little bit more about the region, its post-Soviet history, what other Russians make of it. Bring us up to speed here, if you could.
Yeah, but to be honest, I'm not really like a native from there. I was born in the Sakhalin region, but it's a neighboring one. But yeah, I spent 9 years there in Khabarovsk myself. And yeah, so I guess before actually talking about this politics and what's happening right now, it's important to know how people who live there actually feel themselves as residents of Khabarovsk Krai, Khabarovsk region. So basically, maybe I can start with a little bit of late Soviet history. It was really like one of the industrial centers of the Far East. And the Soviet people were coming to the Far East because first there was like so-called the Far Eastern coefficient to their salaries, so they could really get some money working there. And also it was sort of like this. There was a Soviet logic of industrializing and developing the outskirts of the Soviet Union, right, in the Far East of the Soviet Union. But then when the Soviet Union collapsed, obviously its fall hit the region really hard, and not only the Khabarovsk Krai, but other Far Eastern regions as well. So, and actually in the late 80s, the former governor of Khabarovsk Krai, Viktor Ishaev, he came to power. I guess he was the deputy. If I'm not mistaken, yeah, he was the first deputy chairman of the executive committee of the Khabarovsk Regional Council of People's Deputies. So he was pretty much like the vice governor of the region. So and this is how he became, in the post-Soviet times, the governor of the region, and he had been in power till 2009. But people who follow Russian history, they should know that actually in the 90s there was like this so-called period of wild capitalism, mafia, poor state capacity. The state structures literally was dysfunctional. So, and Viktor Ishaev was one of that strongmen who controlled the region. Obviously, he had some ties with the local elites, both legal and illegal. He had some connections with the factories, important economic centers. Therefore, he managed to keep the living standards there more or less livable, if I can say that. Right, but after the unification of power, when Vladimir Putin came to power, obviously, this kind of skills became not enough for a person to lead the Russian region. So, and he left the office in 2009 when Vyacheslav Sport became the governor. So. Yeah, at the same time, Viktor Ishaev was a member of so-called tandem in the region with the mayor of Khabarovsk, Alexander Sokolov, also a late Soviet bureaucrat Then he worked in the 90s in the local but leading oil petroleum distributor. So, and then he became a mayor of Khabarovsk. I guess it was in 2000. And he had been a mayor till 2018. So these two men sort of controlled the region and people may argue now, but more or less respected in the region. So, but when Ishaev left the office and Vyacheslav Spor came, it suddenly changed the relations of the state with the local, both economic elites and the people who live there. And what we see now that actually Vyacheslav Spor didn't really become a famous politician. He wasn't really respected in the region that is actually that just has, I guess, 1,300,000 people. So it's more or less like the population of Estonia, but its territory is so the territory of Khabarovsk Krai can accommodate the UK, Belgium, Belarus, and Italy. So it's really a huge region. I guess it is the third in Russia. And in this sort of region with just 1 million people living there, an unpopular politician is known by everyone, and its unpopularity is so quickly spread, can spread very quickly.
Yeah. So I have a question, actually, if I may interject for a second. So there are certainly, turning to, I guess, the current situation and the protest vote, which we'll get to, there are lots of unpopular politicians in Russia, or at least politicians to whom the populace is generally apathetic. So what did Sport do or not do to kind of win the antipathy of people in the region? Was it an economic problem? What caused the displeasure that we're seeing manifested today?
Yeah, that's a good question. But I guess, again, I would like to start with some background. I guess it's also important to keep in mind that Khabarovsk region is located 6,000 kilometers away from Moscow. It takes like approximately 8 hours by plane to get there. Just to compare, for example, this is the flight from Berlin to New York. So it's pretty far away. And if, for example, a family decides to leave usually the Far East, they just move to Krasnodar or St. Petersburg. It's just the ultimate decision. They never come back, right? So there is this, like, I guess, a little bit different social structure. People who live there in the Khabarovsk Krai, they like really live there. They either don't want to leave it or just don't have, I don't know, financial resources to do this. So they have higher, genuinely higher demands for their local government to keep their living standards better. But talking about Vyacheslav Spor, so I mean, we can speculate a lot about his personal qualities, but just a couple of facts. So he came to power in 2009, right after the financial crisis, right? And Khabarovsk Krai back then, even in 2009, was performing lower than the Far Eastern Federal District on average in terms of its growth of the gross regional capital. Also, Sport was from the United Russia Party, and obviously all federal politics sort of affected his popularity in the region. And at the same time, there were a couple of facts with actually the mayor of Khabarovsk, Alexander Sokolov, that just brought hardcore evidence that Sport and Sokolov were somehow involved in corruption. Just for example, when Furgal came to power, he decreased his salary, and people just realized that actually Sport was getting approximately $20,000 a month in a region in the Far East of Russia. $20,000 a month, it's a lot. It's not a lot, like it's incredibly a lot. So wow. You can buy, I don't know, whatever.
Pretty generous salary, to say the least. One thing I wanted to press you on or ask further about. So you talked about Sport's association with federal politics, and you mentioned what the Khabarovsk being 6,000 kilometers from Moscow. It kind of feels almost like, I guess, the closest equivalent here in the States would be Alaska in terms of just being gigantic and far removed. I know in Alaska, they talk about the lower 48, just the rest of the country. To what extent does Moscow influence daily life that far away? Does it influence daily life? It really sounds like there's kind of a unique regional character where local politics may even be more important than federal politics.
Well, yeah, this is also a tricky question. I guess let me start maybe with the background of the Russian federalism. So Russia, as I guess a lot of people know, is a highly centralized country. So it's like it's called like the Russian Federation, but it's in fact it's a highly centralized state. Centralized in which way? In terms of financial resources and political power. So back in 2004, the governor election has been cancelled, and also the financial resources, regional and local taxes, some of them were centralized to Moscow. So, and Moscow started playing somewhere in 2004 and 2005 much stronger role in all regions, including Khabarovsk Krai. At the same time, Sport and his team and Sokolov was part of the United Russia, the Federal Power Party, and in Khabarovsk region, there is also a city called Komsomolsk-on-Amur. There is a very important aircraft factory. We call it KNAPA. So basically, it produces Sukhoi aircrafts, like military aircrafts. And it's rich with natural resources, gold reserves, and wood. So, and these are economic sectors. At the same time, when the region is located so far away from Moscow, it creates both logistical problems with controlling like this centralized sectors, and at the same time ideological. So we are so far away from you, but you don't really know how we live here, how to control, how to live actually in a region with a very harsh climate and bordering China. So, and therefore it creates this like grievances not only in Khabarovsk Krai, but in the Far East in general.
So with these grievances, I think this is the perfect segue to talk about the current situation. Both the protests now, but yet more background, the protest vote. So first, let's talk about what happened in gubernatorial elections, because this does not happen in Russia a lot, where an incumbent gets unseated. So can you walk us through what happened in that process?
So yeah, in 2018, Sport lost elections and Furgal came to power. In the second vote, actually, it was almost a landslide. I guess it was maybe around 70% of votes. And it was a big surprise, both in the region and actually in Moscow. And there were also a couple of problems for the United Russia in Primorsky Krai, where Vladivostok is, and in some other areas of the Far East. So it was like sort of first signal that something went wrong in 2018. And like if we look back in 2018, Furgal was just a member of LDPR, but also he had been the member of State Duma, the Russian parliament, from Komsomolsk-on-Amur. So he was quite well known in the region. Not as well known, for example, as the governor, but obviously some people knew him. He was also born in the neighboring region, Amursk region, and so he was kind of an ideal opposition candidate in that part of Russia. But actually, I guess what is also even more important that in a year from 2018 to 2019, the United Russia lost quite a number of towns, villages in the region. So next year in 2019, the United Russia lost the City Duma of Khabarovsk. I guess they now have 2 seats, if I'm not mistaken, out of 30-ish. Also Komsomolsk-on-Amur and city councils in Amursk and Sovetskaya Gavань. So like in a couple of local towns as well. So it was like quite a significant and unprecedented result in the whole like region that the United Russia just literally lost. Yeah, and Furgal started implementing some what usually people call populist, but I, to be honest, don't really believe it's populist. It's just basic decisions that people really wanted. For example, he first, as I told you, right, he decreased his salary from $20,000 to just $5,000. Still quite high, but much better than it was before. He also equalized school meals, like meals in schools. So before him, there were like free lunch kids and paid lunch kids, right? And free lunch families got worse food than their like more prosperous parents. So it was like a very sensitive issue. He just equalized. So he started to pay for families for so it was like kids with free lunches to make them as good as ordinary like other kids in schools get. So, and he also focused on some basic infrastructural projects like, I don't know, boiler stations, local airports, medical infrastructure. And he multiplied his effects of policymaking with the very, very active information campaigns. He was super open. He had his Instagram page, for example, where he quarterly, like once in 3 months, he organized online meetings with his constituency. He included people from all over the region to talk to him, to share their concerns, and also obviously his team, his PR team, and press secretary did a great job to spread news about their governor in the region. So I guess this is like this combination of very basic policies and regulations that he made that people really wanted and started feeling their effects quite fast. And also his quite effective PR campaign contributed in his very, very high popularity. And there was a video leaked of his conversation with the Putin's envoy in the Far Eastern Federal District, where actually the envoy was complaining that his rating was higher than the Putin's one. And this is also quite unprecedented because no one in Russia should be more popular than Vladimir Putin. So, and obviously that like spread concerns about his future back even in 2018, beginning of 2019.
So, as far as I've read, the initial vote against Sport was, if anything, and based also on what I've read as far as locals saying, more of a protest vote than about Furgal himself. But it sounds like he really had his finger on the local pulse and was able to, if not build popularity, really connect with the local population. Is that fair to say?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And you're absolutely right that he got elected not as a governor, right, as a future governor. He got elected as a person who opposed the United Russia and the, I would say, quite inadequate federal policies in the region. And yeah, but he became quite popular in like quite short time.
So this is, I guess, really, really particularly interesting because a lot of the time you see the dynamic in Russia with Putin and the governors, at least we call it the good czar, bad boyars. This almost seems like the exact opposite of that, where it's a competent, in-touch regional leader playing against out-of-touch federal elites, which is really quite fascinating. But speaking of federal elites, there began to be a pushback, as we saw, well, with the murder charges against him for one, but also I know in recent years the capital of the Far Eastern Federal District was moved away from Khabarovsk. What caused that?
Yeah, it was actually moved away in 2018 when Furgal, like right after Furgal came to power. I mean, we cannot prove a causal link here, but there was like obviously a correlation. Furgal was elected, and I guess in 2 months the capital was moved to Vladivostok, and it really hit Khabarovsk Krai, like people who live there hard. Both maybe more ideologically than economically, but I guess both had its impact because Vladivostok is naturally much more economically developed city, and it's Primorsky Krai, its region, because again, sea, borders, the Pacific Fleet, and better climate. But Khabarovsk region and Khabarovsk Krai and the city of Khabarovsk, so before the capital was moved, was considered as a sort of an administrative capital. So you do state business in Khabarovsk, but you do economic business in Vladivostok. And there was also this regional maybe competition, what is better, Khabarovsk or Vladivostok? And in 2018, by Putin's decision, it was just, overrun and the people who live in the Khabarovsk Krai just felt, lost and disenfranchised in this regard. And obviously, they felt as residents who were punished for not supporting the member of the United Russia.
And it doesn't sound like they were the only ones punished, because just this summer, all of a sudden, Furgal was charged with complicity in murder dating back, to the late 90s, early 2000s. Tell us more about the charges. It seems almost curious whether it's even plausible he was involved. And if he was, why bring it up now? Why not? Why wait?
Yeah, so this is a very complicated story. So Furgal was a businessman back in 1999, I guess, to 2006-ish, before he became the member of the parliament. So he was trading timber and black metal in the region, in Khabarovsk region. So back then, he became actually quite rich as a person. And in that period of time, in the Far East, that's economic sector was, I would say, genuinely very, how can I put it diplomatically here, maybe, criminalized. So because, again, due to the institutionalization of state structure, it was first Putin's term, just the government started regaining their control over the economic sectors. So, and the official investigation wants to prove that he was responsible for organizing murder of his business partners in 2005 and 4. And but the depositions came from his fellow business partner, also back in the days. I guess his name is Nikolai Mistrikov. And this is where quite gray story starts. First, Nikolai Mistrikov was arrested in 2019 in October and charged with the same offenses, like organizing murders. But when he was detained, he was diagnosed with cancer. He got blind in one eye, and according to his own terms, his own words, the diagnosis procedures were conducted by students and without anesthesia. So, and all this, and also it's important to point here that the investigators committee refused to make the case public. So, and the way how Furgal was arrested and how this investigation was carried out raised us some suspicion. And yeah, and also important to point out here that Furgal was, the way how the governor was arrested also was considered as some kind of punishment by the central power, by Moscow of the region. So in July, I guess on the 10th of July, Furgal was going to his office, but his car, his routine car, was stopped by Moscow Special Operations Unit. He was in a suit. He was arrested, charged, and brought to Moscow. So when the residents were just, in the morning going to their work, schools, and so on, they realized that actually their governor was arrested by some people unidentified who came from Moscow and who took their governor back with them. So again, ideologically, it was considered as maybe even a kidnapping by some people who no one knows in the region, but who worked on the case of alleged murder of businessmen in 2004 and 2005.
So I guess a question, and this is revealing, I hope this is not a bias. It seems like, just to be clear, he may have actually been involved in criminal activity. The question is whether that has anything to do with why he was arrested over it, 15 years later now? That's what seems particularly suspicious here. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is very hard to talk about it because obviously killing someone is bad. And Russians also believe it's bad. But how can I put it? So So let me maybe give you an example. If you go, let's say, on the streets of every city in Russia, and you ask an ordinary person, let's say a woman of 50 years old, about what they think about their politicians and bureaucrats, especially like on the federal level, somewhere in high positions. And the average person would tell you that obviously all of them were criminals in the 90s and they just got co-opted in the state structures. So a lot of people just believe that all these member of parliament, people in the presidential administration, maybe even Putin himself, were somehow involved in illegal or even like openly criminal activities back in the 90s, because this is how messy Russia was in that period of time. And when you arrest a very, very popular governor who implemented some basic but highly needed policies with charges that sort of everyone believes that most politicians have in Russia, like all this offenses they could commit actually too. This ideological effect, this effect on how people perceive this crime, I guess just gets smaller and weaker. So, and people just don't react on it as, maybe as I would say a governor somewhere in the UK perhaps could commit like a crime like this.
So turning to what's happening now, we've had huge protests by the region. I mean, whole percentage points of the regional population, the residents of Khabarovsk turning out multiple weekends in a row. We have a new LDPR governor who is putting it diplomatically like you did, an interesting person, let's say. Let's talk about what people on the streets think of what's happened, what has happened with the new governor, and weirdly, why, protests in Russia are frequently suppressed, oftentimes fairly violently, why this has been allowed to continue. What's happening today? What does it mean for federalism in Russia? Is this a threat to the system, or is this more a regional dynamic? But starting with the protests and the new governor Diktaryov, what's the story there?
So yeah, to put this long story short, I would call it like that the Kremlin made a failure after a failure. So in Khabarovsk, in the region, protests started immediately after Furgal was arrested. I guess even in that day when he was arrested on the 10th of July. And they have been continuing since the 10th of July. First, what people were speaking there, it was quite a multifaceted protest. Some were protesting for Furgal to get him back, not to release him from detention, just to bring him back and to bring the court in the region and to sort of how can I put it? Initially, the protest was quite multifaceted. So some people protested pro Furgal for him. They just wanted to bring him back, and obviously not to cancel his charges, but just to try him in the region. Then some were just had a very strong regional identity, and they wanted to express their anger towards Moscow's decisions. And some were obviously anti-Putin, as you may see protests somewhere in Moscow or St. Petersburg. But when Diktaryov was appointed just a few days ago, this, I believe, changed how the residents started feeling about both themselves and their case. Because Diktaryov is a very young politician. He was, I would say he's a real populist in a way that he does everything to stay in federal politics, and he's a fellow member of the party, and he respects Zhirinovsky a lot. Even his speech, his voice is so much similar to Zhirinovsky's. He's not from the region. He's from Samara, in the western part of Russia, and he refused to go to the protesters and to speak to them. And His appointment was made maybe again as quite brute punishment by Moscow of the region for their protest activities, right? He was appointed by Putin. And also, I actually spoken to some of my friends there, and they were watching Putin announcing that Dektarov would become a governor of Khabarovsk Krai, and they were like, "Oh, look at how was he smile how Putin was smiling when he was saying like that Dektarov would become a governor. He did not respect us at all. Like this is how they described." They are surprised maybe that Vladimir Putin made that decision. So, and what we see now, especially today, there was a huge protest, maybe around 50,000 people on the streets, that more and more anti-Putin slogans and banners were on the streets. And people actually started, federalizing their demands and going against the federal government, unfair elections, and obviously Dektarev.
I saw you posted from the social media out there. Someone, I think, sums it up nicely. Said along the lines of Moscow is spitting in our face. Fair to say that's the feeling right now?
Yeah, I would say yeah, absolutely. And yeah, going back to your question about the local law enforcement there. So why don't they just repress and suppress protests? First, because you just can't easily suppress 50,000 people in a city of 600,000 people. Also, there were a couple of other protests in smaller towns in the region, quite unprecedented for them again, because if you have a town of 20,000 people and you have just 1,500 people on the street, for Russia it's very unprecedented. And secondly, I've heard some rumors, I cannot confirm that even local police officers were sort of letting their family members to go to protest for their governor because they also supported Furgal while they were on active duty, on the streets. So this created this this clash of their maybe duty and their personal beliefs and political positions. And yeah, and I also believe that Moscow just has someone who fortunately tells local decision makers not to use force, because people are really angry. A lot of them are on the streets, and using force now, I don't know. I guess no one really knows what it can bring. I hope they have in mind the Ukraine's experience in 2013 when they suppressed protests in Kiev, and it was quite on small scale, and then it just recreated itself in a huge Maidan that just ultimately overthrew the government.
So final question: does this tell us anything about federalism in Russia? Is this just a regional problem, or is this indicative of maybe the underlying feelings elsewhere? How much can we learn about Russia as a whole based on what's happening in Khabarovsk?
Oh yes, absolutely. It is a problem about the Russian federalism. So first thing first, I would say that if Russia was more decentralized, we wouldn't have Furgal in the first place. So the regional politicians would have more power to do their jobs better. Secondly, if after his arrest, not Putin was to appoint a new governor, but say either someone from the regional Duma or a new elections would just come up in September. That would also change how protesters, how people who live in the region would have thought about their cause, their protest. And thirdly, obviously, it is about financial resources that the federal central controls. Again, when people understand that actually that governors should have very positive relations with Putin and with presidential administration to keep some basic policies in place that shifts quite some part of responsibility from the governor to Moscow. So, and here we have a highly centralized system that actually Putin hoped to establish, that shows its weakness. When we have a problem in the region, especially during the pandemic and after its first effects started to impact the region, we see that local residents start to protest not only for their governor or some local issues, but so when we have a highly centralized federal system that actually Putin wanted to establish at the first place, and at the same time first pandemic effects and the political problem related to the arrest of the regional governor, some responsibility is naturally shifting from the regional politics to the federal one, and it multiplies its importance to the Kremlin. So yeah, the federal system that exists now in Russia obviously has perhaps unexpected consequences that we see right now.
And to quote Spider-Man here, with great power for Putin comes great, evidently personal responsibility, it seems. Kirill, thank you so much for joining us. This was really enlightening, and I hope the listeners will have learned something about Khabarovsk today.
Thank you. I read my letter.
Thanks to Kirill for joining, and to you too. Stay tuned for next episode, because we have another crisis in Russia's neighborhood to discuss. BMB is a project of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank in Philadelphia. For more information about this and other initiatives, be sure to visit fpri.org. And be sure to follow BMB Russia and Ukraine at the Twitter handle @BearMarketBrief. Catch you next time.